The barn was quiet, save for the soft creaking of the rafters and the rhythmic hiss of the wind against the old wooden slats. Thomas Alvarez moved stiffly through the shadows, his boots crunching on straw as he poured feed into the trough. Dust motes swirled in the single beam of moonlight that filtered through the cracked roof. The donkey in the corner, gray and motionless, lifted its head at the sound but received no glance in return. Thomas didn't talk to animals anymore. Didn't talk to people either, not unless it was necessary. He set the feed bucket down and leaned against the stall, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't noticed the tremors before last winter, but they were getting worse now, especially when the nights grew long and silent. In the far corner of the barn, tacked to the wall like a wound he couldn't stop picking, hung a child's drawing. Faded from time and light, it showed a horse with angel wings flying over a field of wildflowers. In crayon letters at the bottom, the name Ellie curved like a smile. He didn't look at the drawing. He didn't have to. It lived behind his eyes, burned there from 5 years of staring. The news hadn't changed. No leads, no suspects. Just a child gone missing on a sunny afternoon, swallowed by the kind of mystery that time never solves. He could still hear the last words she said to him. Asterisk, Daddy. I'm gonna draw Dusty with wings, so he can find me if I get lost. Asterisk, he hadn't laughed. He hadn't paid attention. He was too busy arguing on the phone, too busy being important. He shook the memory off and turned back toward the door. Come on, he muttered without emotion. Dusty plodded behind him, always obedient, always near. Thomas had picked him up at a silent auction a year ago, intending to use him for farm labor, but never found much work worth doing. The donkey was old, with cloudy eyes and a sagging back, more companion than tool now. Outside, the wind had picked up. Trees groaned under the weight of it. The clouds were folding in on the moon, and the first drops of rain began to fall like soft taps on a coffin lid. Thomas squinted at the distant ridge, the one that overlooked the forest. He used to climb it with Ellie. She'd named a crooked rock at the top Mount Hope. He hadn't been up there since the search party gave up. He locked the barn and turned toward the cabin, shoulders hunched against the wind. Dusty stood motionless behind him, staring toward the trees. Thomas called him twice before the donkey finally trudged forward. Inside, the fire in the stove had died down. He didn't bother rekindling it. The cold suited him. He sank into his worn chair and picked up the photo album that lay beside it. He turned a few pages, slowly, methodically, until her face appeared. 7 years old, missing teeth, holding a sketch pad like it was treasure. His hand tightened. The bitterness came fast. People had told him to move on. That grief lost its shape after enough time. But they didn't know what it was like to search the woods at night screaming a child's name into a silence so thick it echoed back your own guilt. They didn't know how it felt to pray every night and get no answer. And then one day, stop praying altogether. The thunder rolled once, low and deep, followed by the sound of something sharp, wood breaking. Thomas stood up. The barn. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The wind had turned violent. He stumbled through the rain, past the fence, down the muddy path. When he reached the barn, the door was wide open, swinging on broken hinges. "Dusty!" he shouted, heart racing. The stall was empty. He looked around the paddock, scanning the darkness. No hoof prints. No sign. The trees shuddered under the wind's fury, branches flailing like arms. Lightning cracked above, revealing nothing but shadows and mud. He cursed under his breath. Stupid animal. He grabbed a lantern from the barn wall, lit it, and headed for the forest. His boots sank into the softened earth as he pushed forward. The light flickered, casting long, nervous shadows between the trees. He moved quickly, calling Dusty's name half-heartedly, more from habit than hope. After 20 minutes, he stopped. He'd come to the old stream, where Ellie used to drop flowers. The water was swollen now, muddy and fast. He scanned the trees. Nothing. Then a sound, soft, steady hooves. He turned. Dusty was standing there, soaked, unmoving, a dark shape barely outlined by the lantern's glow. Thomas exhaled in frustration. "Where the hell did you?" He stopped. Something was in Dusty's mouth. A rolled piece of paper, damp but intact. The donkey took 2 steps forward and dropped it at his feet. Thomas stared at it, frozen. Then slowly, he knelt down and picked it up. His hands trembled as he unrolled the page. It was a drawing. A horse with wings. Drawn in crayon. The lines were shaky, as if done by a small hand, but the style was unmistakable. The grass, the little sun with smiling rays, even the crooked E in the corner. Ellie. He stared at the date written in blue pencil. Yesterday. He felt the breath leave his lungs in one long, soundless rush. The rain fell harder, soaking the page, but he didn't move. His knees sank into the mud, and still he knelt there, staring at the impossible. His lips parted. No words came. Only questions. Only ghosts. He looked at Dusty. The donkey stared back with calm, unwavering eyes. And in that moment, Thomas Alvarez, man of reason, man of absence, man of rage, felt something crack in his chest. Something he thought had died years ago. He clutched the paper to his chest and whispered, voice hoarse and breaking, "Where did you find this?" Dusty simply turned and looked back toward the forest, toward something waiting in the dark. And for the first time in 5 years, Thomas followed. Thomas hadn't slept. The drawing lay on the table under a paperweight, its edges curling slightly from the damp, but the colors, those strange, joyful colors, still glowed under the morning light. He stared at it like it might vanish, afraid to blink too long, afraid to discover it was all a dream. He didn't know what frightened him more, the impossible fact that the drawing existed, or what it meant if it truly came from Ellie. The donkey, Dusty, stood silently near the porch, ears twitching at the wind. Thomas watched him with cautious eyes. There was no logical explanation. No child had been near this property in years. No neighbors within miles. And Dusty, he was just a donkey, an old, tired animal that barely moved faster than a breeze. Yet something had changed last night. Something in the way Dusty had looked at him, like he knew what he carried, like he meant to deliver it. Thomas leaned back in his chair, hands folded, jaw tight. He hadn't believed in science for years, hadn't believed in anything really. Not since the night the world stopped making sense, when Ellie disappeared in a blink, and no prayer, no police, no pleading could bring her back. And now, here was this creature, a beast he had barely noticed until now, bringing him something that shook the very foundation of his disbelief. The morning air was cool, but Thomas felt a strange warmth creeping into his chest. He stood up abruptly, walked out to the porch, and approached Dusty. The donkey turned his head, calm and still. "Where did you find it?" Thomas asked softly. Dusty blinked. "Was it the woods?" "Nothing." Thomas laughed bitterly and turned away. "I'm talking to a donkey now." "Great. 5 years of silence, and suddenly I'm losing my damn mind." He took 3 steps back toward the house, then stopped. Dusty had moved, not just turned, but stepped off the porch and began walking. Slow, deliberate, as if he expected to be followed. Thomas watched him for a moment, unsure. Dusty paused halfway down the trail, glanced over his shoulder, and waited. With a hesitant breath, Thomas grabbed his coat and followed. They crossed the field, past the broken fence post, and down the overgrown path that hadn't been used since the searches ended. Branches slapped against his shoulders. Brambles clawed at his boots. But Dusty walked steadily, never hesitating, never rushing. After nearly half an hour, the trees began to change, denser, darker, older. The trail dipped into a shallow ravine, and Thomas stumbled over a root, catching himself with a grunt. When he looked up, Dusty had stopped beside a tree, an ancient oak, its bark scarred and twisted. Thomas approached slowly. At the base of the tree, nestled in the roots, something was tucked into a dry crevice. Dusty nudged it with his nose. Thomas crouched and pulled it out. A plastic sandwich bag, faded and clouded with age. Inside, another piece of paper, folded twice, edges torn. He peeled it open. Another drawing. A house with a red roof. A girl in a blue dress. And a donkey with wings, flying above her head. This one was older, the lines less steady, the colors less vibrant. But the signature was the same. "Ellie," he whispered. His knees gave slightly, and he sat back on the ground, staring. His fingers trembled. This one had a date, too, 3 years ago. That meant she had been alive. Or someone wanted him to believe she was. He turned to Dusty, who simply stared, eyes soft and silent. "How are you doing this?" he asked. The donkey shifted his weight, but remained quiet. Thomas's voice cracked. "Why now?" The breeze whispered through the trees. Leaves rustled like voices too faint to hear. The forest didn't answer. Dusty moved forward again. Thomas stood slowly, tucking the bag into his coat. He followed, his heart pounding now, not with fear, but with something closer to hope. Distant, fragile, but real. They walked until the sky began to darken. Shadows stretched long across the trail, and Thomas realized how far they had come. He didn't recognize this part of the woods. Everything felt older, untouched. Dusty stopped near a rocky ledge, overlooking a narrow creek. The water moved gently, clear and shallow. Thomas sat on a fallen log, exhausted. He looked at Dusty, who stood a few feet away, chewing grass like the whole journey had meant nothing to him. "You just happen to find things, huh?" Thomas said. "Things no one else could." Dusty didn't respond, of course, but the stillness of the woods, the way the light filtered through the trees, made Thomas feel as if something greater was listening, watching, or guiding. He reached into his coat and took out the second drawing, holding it up to the fading light. His throat tightened. Ellie hadn't just drawn these. She had left them, on purpose, maybe hoping someone would find them, maybe knowing Dusty would. A memory surfaced, faint, fuzzy. Ellie brushing the horse that used to live in their backyard, whispering to him, saying things like, "Animals know secrets, Daddy. They just don't tell unless you really listen." He hadn't listened. Not then. He lowered the drawing, feeling the weight of 5 lost years pressing down on him. He looked at Dusty. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for not believing in anything, for not believing in you." Dusty raised his head. His eyes met Thomas's, and in their quiet gaze, something passed between them. Not words, not reason, just understanding. They camped beside the creek that night. Thomas made a small fire from twigs and dry moss. He ate from a can of beans, gave Dusty half an apple from his coat pocket. Neither of them spoke, but neither needed to. The silence was no longer empty. Later, as the fire dimmed, Thomas pulled out both drawings and studied them again. His eyes traced every crayon line, every curve of Ellie's shaky handwriting. Then something caught his eye. In the second drawing, the older one, there was a small shape in the corner. A tree, bent sideways with a broken branch, drawn in dark green. Thomas looked up at the oak tree beside the creek. Same curve, same break. She'd drawn this place. He stood up slowly, heart hammering. Dusty was already on his feet, ears perked, facing the deeper woods. Thomas folded the drawings gently, placed them in his coat. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's keep going." And with that, they vanished into the trees once more. The sun was barely up when Thomas stirred from the cold ground, joints stiff, neck aching from a night spent against the hard bark of a tree. The fire had long since died. Beside him, Dusty remained standing, quiet and still, like a sentry keeping watch. Thomas blinked the sleep from his eyes and looked again at the tree with the bent branch, so perfectly matched to the one in Ellie's old drawing. The coincidence was too precise, too intentional. He reached into his coat and unfolded the papers once more. The colors were dull now, the creases deeper, but the message hadn't faded. Ellie had been here. Not imagined, not mistaken. She had stood under that very tree and drawn it, years ago. That meant she'd survived, at least long enough to leave signs. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. Hope was a dangerous thing to carry, especially after years of silence. But it was rising inside him, uninvited and relentless. Dusty began to move again without warning, picking his way across the shallow creek. Thomas grabbed his bag and followed, boots splashing through the cold water. The path on the other side narrowed, overgrown and wild, with branches thick enough to claw at skin. They traveled in silence, the forest around them growing darker with each step. There was no trail anymore, just instinct, memory, and trust in the animal leading him. After an hour, the trees thinned, revealing an old wire fence half swallowed by ivy. Beyond it lay the ruins of what had once been a large wooden structure, collapsed walls, a sagging roof, and charred beams. Thomas approached slowly, eyes scanning the blackened remains. The smell of old smoke still clung to the stones. He stepped through the shattered doorway, heart pounding. This place had burned years ago. He could tell by the layers of ash and the way nature had started reclaiming it. Vines coiled through broken floorboards. Moss clung to scorched bricks. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, until Dusty brayed behind him, low and urgent. Thomas turned. Dusty had stopped near a sunken part of the floor. Something metallic glinted under a pile of debris. Thomas knelt down, brushing aside the ash and rubble. A rusted tin lunchbox. He pried it open, his fingers trembling. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, were several drawings, carefully folded, protected from the elements. His breath caught as he pulled them out one by one. They were all Ellie's. Her distinct, clumsy lines. Her son with the same smile. The same winged donkey, always in the sky. But these were more detailed, more mature. Some even had words scribbled beside them. Safe here. Dusty remembers. He will find you. Beneath the drawings was a small, spiral notebook. The cover was worn, the pages warped. He opened it. Asterisk, Dear Daddy. I don't know where you are, but I think Dusty knows. I hope he finds you. I believe he will. I believe in him. Asterisk. Tears welled in his eyes. He sat there, clutching the notebook, unable to breathe. Ellie had lived here. Alone or with someone. He didn't know. But she had written to him. Drawn for him. Left breadcrumbs in a forest that had long since swallowed her voice. And somehow a donkey, an old, quiet animal with tired eyes, had found them. The walls around him blurred. For years, he had cursed God. Cursed faith. Now he could barely speak for the weight in his throat. He had been blind. Deaf. But the signs were always there. He'd just stopped looking. Or maybe he had been too afraid to believe. He turned to Dusty. The donkey stood patiently, head slightly bowed, as if understanding the sacredness of the moment. Thomas knelt in front of him and placed a hand on his muzzle. You're not just some animal, he whispered. You knew. You remembered her. Dusty didn't move, didn't blink. His stillness was answer enough. Thomas stood and tucked the notebook into his coat. I'm not done, he said. If she was here, she could still be out there. Somewhere. They left the ruins in silence. The sky was changing now, clouds gathering thick and gray. Rain was coming, but Thomas didn't care. He had warmth again. Purpose. A path. Even if it led to more pain, he had to follow it. As they traveled farther north, the terrain grew harsher. Rocks jutted from the earth. The wind screamed between trees like voices crying out from long ago. Thomas was tired, but he didn't stop. Dusty moved ahead, unwavering. By midday, they reached a cliffside overlook. The forest spread below them like an ocean of green, endless and untamed. A narrow trail wound along the ridge and disappeared into the fog. Thomas leaned against a boulder, breathing hard. The world felt huge again, dangerous, but also alive. From his pack, he retrieved Ellie's notebook and flipped to the last page. Asterisk, he watches over us. Even when we can't see him. Even when we stop believing. The animals still know. Asterisk. It was the last entry. The ink smeared slightly, as if by tears or rain. Thomas stared out over the ridge, his eyes scanning the horizon. There in the distance was a small plume of smoke rising. Faint, almost hidden by mist. A cabin. A fire? He looked down at Dusty. The donkey was already facing the direction of the smoke, ears perked. Thomas didn't need to think. He shouldered the bag and whispered, "Let's go." And they began to descend the ridge, step by step, into the unknown. The path down the ridge was narrow, carved by nothing more than deer hooves and time. Thomas moved cautiously, one hand gripping Dusty's bristled mane for balance as loose stones shifted beneath his boots. The mist thickened around them, curling through the trees like fingers, pulling them forward. Below, the column of smoke drifted steadily into the sky. A signal, a whisper, or maybe a promise. Thomas didn't know what waited at the end of this trail, but for the first time in years, he didn't fear the unknown. When they reached the base of the slope, the forest opened into a quiet clearing. A small wooden cabin stood at its heart, weathered but intact. Its roof was patched with tin sheets, a chimney puffing out soft gray smoke. Flowers bloomed wild along the base of the porch. It looked lived in. Maintained. Not abandoned like the ruins they had found before. Thomas froze at the tree line. His breath was shallow. Every instinct in him screamed caution. What if it wasn't her? What if it was just another cruel coincidence? Or worse, what if she had been here and wasn't anymore? Dusty moved forward, slow and unbothered, as if returning to a place he knew well. Thomas followed, each step heavier than the last. His heart pounded harder with every footfall until he stood at the bottom of the porch steps, staring at the worn front door. He knocked once, gently. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open, not by hand, but from age and the tug of the wind. A voice called from inside, soft and cautious. "Who is it?" Thomas stepped forward. "My name's Thomas Alvarez. I'm looking for my daughter." There was a long pause. The seconds stretched unbearably. Then, slowly, a woman emerged from the shadowed doorway. She was in her early 30s, her face lined with quiet strength. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. She looked Thomas over with a guarded expression. "You were the one searching," she said. "Years ago." Thomas nodded. "She was 7 when she vanished. Ellie. Her name is Ellie." The woman looked past him at Dusty, and something shifted in her face. Something fragile, something familiar. "Come inside," she said. The cabin smelled like cedar and old books. Drawings lined the walls, dozens of them. Crayon, pencil, watercolor. Thomas moved toward one near the window. It was unmistakably Ellie's. A field of yellow flowers, a blue sky, a donkey with wide wings, soaring over a cabin. "She was here," he whispered. The woman nodded. "I found her 6 years ago. Injured. Alone." She couldn't remember much. Her speech was scrambled. She mentioned a name, Dusty, and she said he'd find her daddy someday. I tried to contact authorities, but she panicked. She was terrified. Every time I tried to take her to town, she screamed. So I waited. She asked to stay. "Where is she now?" Thomas's voice cracked under the weight of the question. The woman stepped aside and called gently, "Ellie?" Footsteps padded across the floor above. A moment later, a girl appeared at the top of the stairs. Her hair was longer now, falling in dark waves past her shoulders. She looked older, leaner, but her eyes, wide, brown, and full of light, hadn't changed. She clutched a worn sketchbook to her chest as she stared at the man below. Thomas stepped forward, breath catching. "Ellie." She didn't move at first, just stared. Then, slowly, she descended the stairs. Halfway down, she stopped. "I drew Dusty," she said quietly, "so he'd find you." Thomas fell to his knees. She dropped the sketchbook and ran into his arms. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched her close, unable to speak. Every beat of his heart echoed with disbelief, with gratitude, with the ache of 5 years spent in darkness. He buried his face in her shoulder and whispered her name over and over, as if afraid it might disappear again. "I looked everywhere," he choked. "I never stopped. I thought I'd lost you forever." Ellie pulled back and touched his cheek. Dusty never forgot. He knew. Behind them, Dusty brayed softly. Ellie smiled and walked to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "He used to sit by the edge of the trees, waiting," she said. "I told him every day, 'You'll find Daddy.'" And he did. Thomas watched them, his heart full. The disbelief that had weighed him down for years began to fall away, piece by piece. The anger, the guilt, the loss, melted under the warmth of his daughter's voice. Later, as the sky darkened and a storm threatened again, Thomas and Ellie sat on the porch together, watching the horizon. Dusty stood nearby, still as ever, his eyes reflecting the glow of the lantern inside the cabin. Thomas turned to his daughter. "Do you remember much? From before?" Ellie shook her head slowly. "Not everything. Just flashes. You, Dusty, the drawing with wings. I kept drawing so I wouldn't forget." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. She took his hand and whispered, "Do you believe now?" He looked at her, really looked. The miracle of her survival, the path that had led him here, the silent guide who had never left his side. "I do," he said. "I believe in things I can't explain. I believe in second chances." That night, he lay beside the fire, Ellie curled up beside him, her head on his chest. Dusty rested near the door, ears twitching gently in the quiet. Thomas stared at the ceiling, not needing answers. He had everything he'd ever prayed for, returned not by men, not by logic, but by faith, persistence, and the unwavering loyalty of a creature who had never stopped believing. Morning came softly. Thomas stepped outside as the first light broke through the clouds. He turned to Dusty and placed a hand on his back. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving her, for saving me." Dusty closed his eyes and lowered his head. Thomas looked to the hills. The world felt brighter, larger, full of color again. Hope had found its way home, not in thunder or miracles from the sky, but in the steady hooves of a donkey and the crayon lines of a little girl's dream. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring you true, heartfelt stories every day.